Okay. So hi, folks. Fantastic to be back again. I'm Rajiv. I'm one of the managing partners at Orias Venture Partners, an early stage VC fund with 95 startups and 3 unicorns. Welcome. I'm very excited to be doing this session with Paul Krake. Paul has more than 25 years of experience as an economic and political strategist. He's worked with, amongst multiple companies, Goldman Sachs and Macquarie, and has run hedge funds, equity portfolios, all with an Asian viewpoint. He founded The View from the Peak in 2011, seeing a need for a truly global multi-asset class research platform. The firm has offices in Hong Kong, Chicago, and London. In fact, every time I speak to Paul, he's in a different city. So that's one of my questions to you, Paul. How are you able to work around all the travel and quarantine restrictions? Anyway, his View from the Peak has taken its name from Victoria's Peak, the highest point in Hong Kong, and the firm looks at the world from a 360-degree view with a Chinese Asian perspective. Clients include endowments, family offices, government agencies, asset managers, and corporates. Today, Paul will discuss his point of view on developments in the technology sector in China. Ever since the Ant Financial IPO got into heavy waters, the world has been watching the Chinese tech sector as things started getting tighter, both at home and abroad. For instance, the US regulatory norms for foreign listed entities are way tighter today than they were even a year ago. Add to it the trouble with Taiwan and the semiconductor industry. That said, the other side is also that China has been a leader in many of the ESG and climate change technologies and has been setting more aggressive targets than warranted for themselves in terms of what they have taken as CO2 emissions and so on and so forth. So in things like electrical vehicles, batteries, solar panels, renewables, and nuclear, they've all been areas where China has taken a significant lead. So Paul will tie all of this together, everything I just mentioned, into one cogent story, which is a big act. I, for one, I'm really excited to see how this round peg will fit into a square hole. So I'm going to be really looking forward to this. And one last point, Paul. So if you could help us understand what could India do in all of this? In other words, where do we feature? So that would be a little point that I would perhaps ask you to sort of elaborate a little bit more on. So I'm going to hand it over to him for about 30 to 40 minutes. Folks, you don't need to make any notes because we are happy to make this conversation and the slides available after. After this, we'll move to the Q&A discussion. Please type your questions on the chat at any point in time you get them. We'll definitely get to them. I look forward to a productive 60 to 70 minutes. So Paul, over to you.
Rajiv, thank you very much. And look, everyone, thank you for joining today. And I think if I was to make it very succinct and describe the investing landscape, the geopolitical landscape, the prospects of eventually China being, the inevitability of China being the world's biggest economy and everything that comes with that, the word that you need that sums it up is ambiguity. And it was funny, I was doing an interview with a professor at Peking University earlier this week. And we were talking about the variable interest entity. Now, for those of you who don't know what a variable interest entity is, it's the structure that allowed Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and Didi to go public, predominantly in the United States, but also applies to Hong Kong. So let me explain to you how a variable interest entity actually works. So let's start off with the fact they're illegal. They are illegal in China, right? So how it actually works is there's a structure which is illegal in China, which has allowed Chinese technology companies to raise hundreds of billions of dollars in the United States. Oh, and by the way, those investors in the United States that buy these stakes in Alibaba and Tencent and the like, they actually have no legal claim over any of the assets, and they only have a contract or a swap agreement with the company because it's actually illegal under Chinese law for foreigners to own any stakes in internet companies or education companies and the like. And when you hear it like that, which by the way is exactly how it is, you think to yourself, how on earth has this been allowed to persist? And the reality is it's ambiguity. And it's ambiguity because the Chinese, in many cases, pick and choose what rules they enforce. They pick and choose when they enforce those rules. And this framework of ambiguity is very much part of how China deals with its geopolitical issues with the United States, how it deals with its borders, how it deals with Taiwan, how it deals with tech regulation. So over the course of the next 30 or so minutes, I'm going to get into a lot of those ambiguities. But first and foremost, I just want to talk about the world through my framework, which is, just bear with me, which is looking at the world through what I call mega thematics, right? And I think if you get these 5 mega thematics right, not just in the context of China, I think it's applicable to India. I think it's applicable to most developed economies. And those 5 frameworks are as follows. For me, front and center is the US-China relationship. Now, as you saw at the front of this slide, my parent company is called View from the Peak. But what we have underneath this is a series of forums, one of which is US-China series. We're launching a forum called Climate Transformed over the course of the next couple of months. We're going to look at mobility and e-commerce and fintech. And all of these are these mega thematics that we need to assess if you're looking at any investment opportunity on a multi-year view. So in the Chinese context, the US-China relationships is vital. The decoupling, the technology independence, issues over Taiwan and the South China Sea, China bridging the military gap with the United States, Chinese technology companies, copying Chinese technology companies, which is the opposite of where things have been for the last 20 years. Will there be listed companies in the United States past 2024 and the like? And the complexities around the US-China relationship is a vital input into look at how China, not only what is the trajectory of Chinese growth in the years ahead, but what that composition of that growth will look like. Secondly is the concept of mega cap technology companies. Now, for years, and I mean decades, there has been this rule of thumb where there was a notion that every 10 years or so, the top 10 market cap companies in the world would change, right? And I now believe that has come to an end, right? So ExxonMobil was once the world's biggest company. ExxonMobil can't make cars, but Tesla can be the world's biggest energy company. Right, and Pfizer at one stage was one of the world's biggest companies. Pfizer can never do search, but Google will be able to do healthcare. And you look at Amazon. JP Morgan was once one of the world's biggest companies. JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon will never be able to do e-commerce, but look out for Amazon in financial services. So how these companies innovate, where they direct their capital, what's the market capitalization of Apple, what's the increase in market cap if they decide to get into cars? Frankly, guys, I'll be the first person to buy an Apple car because I don't know what it's like, but I know it's going to be cool. Right. And is that $500 billion of shareholder value? Is it 750? Who knows? Right. Thirdly is government and central bank policy. That states the obvious. We know how much liquidity drives markets. We know what QE does to multiples across the globe. But monetary policy in its traditional sense has become much less relevant because rates are anchored at zero. Now, obviously, in the emerging world, we do have markets that have both positive nominal and real yields. But the reality is that we are anchored in this universe of zero and negative interest rates across the developed world, which means that fiscal policy and the uses of fiscal policy become so much more important going forward. The debates over a universal basic income, MMT in the United States. What does the political cycle mean for the rise of those sort of more sort of socially oriented programs? What do deficits do to the United States going forward? Can the EU hold it together to have uniform, shared obligations and the like? And these are all things that are vitally important in the future of not only the economic cycle, but the next section, which is global asset allocation. I sum this up that this is what I describe as US dollar research. When do we see a point in time where people are prepared to sell the United States, which has been the overweight market for equities and fixed income for several decades, right? And move into EM or move into Europe or look at Japan as an opportunity, or more importantly, what do they do in China, which is rapidly growing to be the world's largest economy, but currently is 17% of global GDP, but only about 5.6, 5.7% of MSCI World, right? That for me is something that's not sustainable going forward, and we look at the cross currents around that. And finally, the biggest of all thematics for the next 50 years is the climate agenda. Goldman Sachs just wrote a report saying to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, the world's going to have to spend $50 billion. Now, I'm sure that there's a model somewhere within the basements of Goldman Sachs that tells you how you get to that $50 billion figure. And I don't know if it's 40 or 60 trillion dollars, I should say. It's a big number. It's going to affect policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, asset allocation, capital allocation for many, many years to come. So let's try to look at where we are with China in terms of all of these dynamics. So my good friend Anna Ashton at the US-China Business Council, I steal this quote from her every 3 months, because every 3 months or so she will update the number, and the number is only going in one direction. So we are currently in the 117th Congress of the United States in the first term of Joe Biden. There are currently 448 anti-China bills in front of Congress, and that is everything from Republican bills for reparations for the Wuhan virus, and that's what's written in the bill, to cybersecurity concerns, to FBI investigation, to forced FBI investigations on Chinese professors at American universities. And to put this in context, in the 107th Congress, just after 9/11, there was only 130 counterterrorism bills, which gives you perspective on just how entrenched the anti-China feelings are in the United States. It gives you a sense that the perception that somehow Joe Biden would be more dovish on China is a complete and utter fallacy, and it shows that the prospect of a reconciliation between the United States and China over the course of the next several years is at best incredibly remote. And I think we all need to be concerned that this technological geopolitical decoupling that we are seeing has much further to go. So let's talk about something which is very, very topical, which is what the capital raising function for Chinese firms, and obviously Didi was front and center of this over the course of the last couple of weeks. And I mentioned at the start with a little anecdote about these variable interest entities, but it's all in this mix where we have this ambiguity again in regards to Chinese companies that are effectively illegally raising capital under Chinese law from Western investors. But we also have a lot of ambiguity on the US side of things as well, because as we stand today, the SEC, or more specifically, the Public Accounting Board, has no access to audit a Chinese company listed on a US exchange. Now, people use the expression, we're either a dragon slayer or a panda hugger in terms of your views on China. And I'd like to class myself as neither. But I'm certainly more on the dragon slaying side of the equation here, because frankly, it's not fair that an Indian company, for example, who is listed in the United States can get audited by the SEC, but their competitor in China cannot, right? And frankly, that's not fair to the Indian companies, the US companies, the Canadian companies that are listed in the US. And the ambiguity is that the NYSE and the NASDAQ and the investment banks that earn hundreds of millions of dollars of fees by bringing a Didi to public, or a Didi public, or eventually a ByteDance public, which is coming, was supposed to be coming very soon, they've pushed back on that. And there has been this ambiguity, this functional disequilibrium, as I like to, dysfunctional equilibrium, as I like to call it, of these companies listing in the United States, but being unable to be audited like the rest of their peers. So as we stand today, there's Congress has basically said that we've got 3 years to sort this out. So by 2024, there is, as we stand today, unless there is massive changes in the transparency of the Chinese government to allow its companies to be audited by US regulators, then Alibaba, JD, Neo, et cetera, will all be forced to delist from US exchanges. And what we've seen with Didi is an extension of this, but this is coming from the Chinese side of things, because the Chinese have announced that this variable interest entity structure that we have turned a blind eye to for 20 years. Well, now's our time that we're going to rein this in, right? So, so you're getting this from both sides. Now, it appears there's going to be a grandfathering in of this rule. So Alibaba used it, and JD used it, and Neo used it, and the like. So they're okay in the near term, even though there's going to be more technology reviews and cybersecurity reviews on these companies, and we'll get into that in just a second. But the reality is that the prospects of big Chinese technology companies listing in the United States going forward is remarkably slim. Now, Hong Kong is a clear beneficiary of all of that, even though people struggle with this a little bit. The listing standards in Hong Kong are so much more stringent than they are in the United States. So why? And you think to yourself, why did Didi, knowing the fact it could be forced to delist in 3 years' time, why would they go to New York and do a listing there? Well, the answer is simple, is because Hong Kong rejected them. And the shareholders, and Rajiv is a VC guy, there's a lot of pressure. I'm sure that he's no stranger to seeing companies being pressured to go public, to allow their VCs to take that liquidity event, and that was certainly the case with Didi. So what you've seen so certainly this is one area where I think there's a bridge that can't be, that has a gaping hole in the middle of it that's probably not going to be mended. And eventually what we'll see is, I think by 2024, that every Chinese company listed on American exchanges will be forced to delist. And that's why you've seen a rush of dual listings in Hong Kong from the like, to make sure there's a plan B in the event that does happen. Now, the second area, which I think is vitally important, and this gets to the crux of the technology independence arguments and the decoupling from a technology standpoint, as the US would describe it, is semiconductors. And what we see, I've got a couple of charts up here, but basically what those charts say is that China buys a lot of chips and doesn't make that many of them. Is the short answer. And whilst we could sit here for hours and sort of dissect the policies of Donald Trump towards China, the most powerful measure that President Trump used towards China was the embargo on semiconductors and semiconductor design. That for me is the crux of the chip shortage that we've witnessed. It basically has exposed a massive strategic vulnerability of the Chinese to be able to access. We've all heard the cliche, data is the new oil. Well, if data is the new oil, then chips are the rigs, the tankers, the gas pumps, the everything to that data. And what we've seen is that China currently doesn't have the design capability, the fab capability, and the like to be able to become chip independent in the same way it wants to be energy independent, food independent, water independent, and the like. And I think it's the right thing to do is to couple that all together and to think about it through that lens. So what are the Chinese doing? Well, the Chinese have the number of $150 billion gets thrown out a lot. And what we're seeing around the world right now, and the United States are doing it, and the Europeans are doing it, and the like, is talking about building their own fabs and having their own production capability. But the reality is that it's all very well and good to have that production capability, but the embargo in the United States is so wide-ranging that it actually goes down to design as well. So TSMC, for example, is in a very tenuous position because a lot of the chips that they are selling to the Chinese have been designed by the likes of Texas Instruments or Nvidia or these sort of companies, which are obviously US domicile companies, which means that in theory that these chips are selling these chips to the Chinese by Samsung or TSMC is actually in contravention of US embargoes. And the question remains about how strict or how ambiguous, again, the US is going to deal with these embargoes to take on companies like TSMC and Samsung to prevent them from selling these chips to China. This is by far the biggest issue in the technology space, in the technology debate between the United States and China. Things like AI research or data centers in the main. I did an interview last night for Bloomberg talking about on the risk of data centers in Hong Kong being taken down by Chinese, by the Chinese requesting information. These are important issues, but they're really tangential in the context of the semiconductor embargo, which is, for me, the greatest strategic risk to China over the course of the next several years. I mean, Huawei could legitimately run out of chips, and there is an existential push by the United States government that started under Trump to basically put Huawei out of business. And if Huawei runs out of chips, your smartphone doesn't run very well if you've run out of chips, and we know how influential Huawei smartphones are across Asia and Europe as well. So for me, the semiconductor side of things is the crucial part of this. And what do we know? We know that the Chinese are not going to lie down and just accept everything the United States throws at them. They're going to do what they do best, and what they do best is spend money on capex. And as someone from the Semiconductor Industry Association said to me recently, the Chinese might spend $250 billion on chip research. Let's say they waste $150 billion of that. Well, they've still got $100 billion of capacity that they can use. And this is one of those market segments where the Chinese cannot and will not fail. It'll take time, and it'll take a hell of a lot of money, but they will eventually get there. So if you couple, let me talk a little bit about technology regulation in the Chinese context. And I do think about this a little differently to everybody else. The China and India actually is, I would say, was not a precursor per se, but certainly was in front of most in this context, right? China's just doing what everyone else in the world wished it could do. So how jealous do you think the EU, the European Commission was, or antitrust regulators in the United States when they looked at Prime Minister Modi banning initially 57 apps, I think it was, of Chinese firms, and they basically just wished they could do that, because at the end of the day you have two things at play. One is Communist Party can do what the Communist Party wants. At the end of it's big and powerful, can do whatever it wants. But the reality is that there are limits to what the party can do, and public opinion is very important here. So just as it is important in the United States or Europe or India or wherever, if the public's not on board, it makes policy implementation that much more difficult. But the reality is that tech regulation is really popular in China, because we often think that maybe the Chinese consumer is somewhat different to other consumers, but they know when free is not free, and they don't want their data to be taken and manipulated by private companies. They're comfortable with the fact that the government might see certain and often a lot of things, but they don't want Alibaba to abuse their data or JD to abuse their data. So they're very comfortable with this whole dynamic. And what we're seeing through this, the second part, I should say, the second part of this is that I think that the regulation you are seeing is not a trying to hold the tech companies back per se, but I think it's more about leveling the playing field, right? So, China is a very regulated economy. right? The banking system, for example, is very heavily regulated. But over the last 8 years or so, you've had these two upstart companies, Alibaba and Tencent, come in and just completely upend the entirety of the banking system in an unregulated way. So what has the government done? Well, the government has gone to Ant Group and said, Ant Group, you need to be a bank holding company. Well, that's not draconian against Ant Group. That just levels the playing field with Bank of China and China Construction Bank, because they're bank holding companies. So what we have now is everything on a level playing field. And look, will that hurt profitability going forward? Yes, it will. Should that naturally shrink the multiples of these companies? Yeah, it does, because you don't have the hyper growth mode that we're a little bit spoiled over the recent years, thinking that things can grow exponentially. And I'm talking to a bunch of Indian investors who work with tech in India. You guys know about stratospheric valuations, right? It's the reality. But why I'm so excited about owning Chinese tech on a 5-year view is the following: that despite regulation, despite cheaper multiples and the like, and I'll show a slide in a second that that Amazon trades at double the valuation of Alibaba and has far superior technology as far as I'm concerned. But at the end of the day, even with regulation, Alibaba is going to dominate retail in China, not just online retail, but offline retail as well. And JD is going to be a very influential player. And you can regulate Tencent gaming all you want, but it is still going to be the dominant player in the gaming sector, which is growing at 15% per year and will probably continue to grow at 15% a year for the next decade. So we're reaching now a point in this regulatory framework where the stocks are undeniably cheap. And I was saying to someone this morning that these are the sort of stocks that we can all own personally. But if you have an investment fund that can't handle a 20% drawdown, it's hard to own these companies now, because you just don't know when the regulatory clampdown is going to stop. And for me, that's the big thing here. That on a 5-year view, a 3 to 5 year view, very comfortable owning these things. I'll go as far to say that this could be one of the best opportunities structurally for the next decade is owning a stock like Alibaba at 22 times forward versus 50 odd times forward for Amazon. But look, you've got to be able to appreciate that you could have another 20% of downside in this environment if the cybersecurity reviews are more stringent. If the data privacy laws are enhanced and all this sort of thing. There are certainly risks going forward, but structurally, I think I see large cap Chinese tech as one of the best opportunities over the course of the next 5 years. So what we've seen in Asia through the course of the first half of the year, and India, frankly, has been a bit of an outlier, you could argue, particularly versus China, is that you've had this massive underperformance of Chinese and Asian equity versus the US, and there's a slew of reasons for that. But I'm not going to get into them all. But it revolves around technology regulation in China and what was previously this notion that Asia was the first economic bloc to come out of the pandemic, and therefore they would be the first ones to tighten. I think that the opportunity set in Asia is incredibly constructive. And I put India into that camp as well. But you are seeing an easing cycle in China is underway. We should all be a little concerned about what that means for regional growth. That maybe the dynamic hyper growth that everyone was anticipating for 2021 and 2022 may not play out to the extent that it has. And it's funny how we were talking about the opportunity sets in Asia, and this for me sums this up perfectly. That China is the outlier in regards to being underrepresented in global portfolios versus its economic influence. So if you combine the fact that Chinese technology companies are incredibly cheap, and I think are a wonderful opportunity for the next 5 years, and the prospect, if China doesn't look too far inward, which is certainly a risk, that there's be a realignment of China being 17% of global GDP, but only 5.6% of MSCI World. That has that hopefully over time we'll see considerable inflows into Chinese equity. Chinese household balance sheets own only about 6% of their household balance sheets are stocks. That number could easily go to double digits over the course of the next 5 years, releasing $1 trillion of additional capital flows into equity markets. So if you combine underexposure of global investors, underexposure of domestic households, and cheap valuations in the most influential companies, and I think you get that there's an opportunity there for China over the course of the long haul. But what does that long haul look like? So the days of excess leverage in China, I think, are well and truly behind us. So since 2016, I think the leverage hawks have been well and truly in charge of the agenda. And you only have to look at this chart here, which I think sums up the Chinese response to the pandemic, where the US threw the kitchen sink, both fiscally and monetarily, or the hybrid that it is now, at the US economy to make sure that companies didn't go bankrupt and consumers were looked after as they lost their jobs. But looking at that chart, China just did its thing. It's sort of Chinese money growth has not really deviated outside of a relatively tight 5% band over the course of the last 6 years or so, and as such, China didn't or doesn't have the excesses that certainly the US and Europe does as well. And all this points to is China looking to have more sustainable growth, more domestically driven growth, and again, looking inward from to develop its own technology standards. And this, for me, points to a basic premise that this is China being more self-reliant, more consumption-driven, looking more like a developed economy going forward. RMB strength is going to be a continual thing that we are looking at. The PBOC has had trouble keeping a lid on the currency over the course of the last 12 months or so. So between outbound tourists and Chinese students, it's about $100 billion a year of outflows that come out of the economy. That was a natural safety valve for renminbi strength over the last 10 years or so. We don't have that, and we're continuing to see greater intervention in the currency market as the PBOC is determined to keep the currency from strengthening. That said, if you are going to be domestically focused like the Chinese are intending to be, a stronger renminbi is a natural course. It's a healthy course, and it's frankly something that Asian economies, when they are performing well, you tend to see domestic strength, which is an aid to domestic consumption. So I'll sort of sum it up in a little bit, but the final thing I want to talk about is the one common area of interest, which is the climate agenda. If there is for me no prospect of a grand bargain between the United States and China. I think that is highly unlikely. And I've been amazed actually how quickly the Western world in particular has forgiven the United States for the sins of Donald Trump and then got on board with an anti-China agenda. The EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment has basically fallen over since the start of the year. But the one area where they can all agree is climate. Are we going to get something out of COP26 where the Chinese and Americans sit down and hold hands and say we need to do this for the world? Potentially, I think it could be more rhetoric than anything else. But the reality is that, this is the one area where they can get together and there be global cooperation. And if you are going to put an optimistic spin on this, that is that if you can do something on climate, then you can maybe do something on tech. You can do something on security in Asia, et cetera, et cetera. So what about just talk about a couple of the risks that I see going forward? Well, and I think that there are two major risks for China. One is the fact that Xi Jinping is ruler for life. And by becoming ruler for life, he has dismantled many of the checks and balances that were put in place going back as far as Deng Xiaoping to ensure smooth transitions of power. And let's be honest, Xi Jinping has a bit of a belly. He's 68 years of age now, and a smoker, right? Not a good thing for someone who you want to be ruler for life. And the concern is that if he dies in office, and frankly, the comparisons to Putin, I think, are very real, even though there are more checks and balances in China than there are in Russia. If Xi is to die in office, then you do have a power vacuum in a society that historically has had more violent transitions of power than passive and smooth transitions of power. It's something we need to be concerned about. It's an unhedgeable risk, but it's something we need to worry about. And secondly is demographics. So when Rajiv and I are in our 80s and we're writing the book on the definitive work on the history of China, we're going to turn around and one of the chapters will be that the one-child policy was an absolute disaster. And what you have in China is a very accelerating demographic cliff that is coming. And this is not like a Japanese demographic cliff where it's just the country got old. This is a country that has got old and has too many guys. The demographic mix between men and women is skewed very heavily and looks remarkably similar to places that have had revolutions in the past. Again, that is not meant to be a scare. That's just an observation, not a precursor to anything. But the reality is that bad demographics are not a good thing for growth. And if you're a one-party state that relies on its credibility of being able to provide speedy economic growth for denying its populace the right to vote, slowing growth because of bad demographics is an awful combination. So that's where we are with sort of this in the US-China context, and on to India. I mean, I think that I wrote a piece about a year ago talking about what I call the rise of tech nationalism, and I look at the Indian economy, and I see no reason with the unlimited potential of the diaspora, the effectively unlimited access to capital, why India can't build its own Google, its own Facebook, its own Nvidia and the like in the years to come. Clearly, Reliance is one of those companies which is looking to do all of the above. But I think that there's going to be a push towards countries, not just Brazil, but I think for example, France would never run without its own banks and railways, but it's very happy giving all of its e-commerce and search over to American companies. I think eventually that changes, and I think that the opportunity sets in India for it to build out its own domestically focused and culturally biased technology companies that's are more applicable than the US centric content that we all get now, I think is very, 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 very real. Clearly, tensions with China are going to remain. China is the bully in the neighborhood, and I think that Xi Jinping is going to pick fights when he needs to pick fights. I don't think it ends up in anything drastic. I don't see Taiwan being taken by force or anything like that, and happy to discuss that later in Q&A. But I think that the opportunities for India, and I think globally, is a world that's going to look a little bit more inward and start to focus on the amazing domestic opportunities that exist in India, just as the likes of Alibaba and Tencent are going to say, the US is just too hard. Let's focus on 1.4 billion growing consumers in China, and if we get that right, with the party's support, then we can achieve great things. So, Rajiv, let's stop there. let's get into it. Let's get into a couple of questions, and hopefully we can end this on an optimistic note, because what we're seeing out of the US-China relationship in particular at the moment is far from that.
Fantastic. So let's just get started. I think I got one hot one from Umang. Basically, I think this point was something that you started off making on variable interest rate entities, variable interest entities, and US listings is sort of being illegal. So the question really is the Hong Kong listing route also illegal, or is that legit?
No, that's illegal as well. That's illegal as well. So it's not the Hong Kong route or the US route that's illegal. It's the variable interest entities themselves that are, because what it does is that strategically important industries like internet and education are not allowed to have foreign ownership, right? So I draw the chart if I had the patience and a large enough whiteboard of the holding companies in Cayman, and there are loads of, it's just incredibly. It makes a Mauritius equity chart look simple. And so it's what these entities do. So when you go public in Hong Kong or go public in how about we stop sharing our screen, or go public in the in Hong Kong or the United States, it's a Cayman entity that's going public, not anything else. So are identical in that regard.
Could you just repeat the last 10 seconds, Paul?
And the US and China are identical in that regard.
Got it. All right. Okay. Excellent. So let me just get started off with a couple of big ones. So I think The Economist led this week with the Biden China doctrine. And I think Antony Blinken was able to corral the entire ecosystem: US, EU, UK, Canada, Australia, your home country, New Zealand, Japan, and the NATO together to condemn the Microsoft attack and talk about cybersecurity. So it looks like ratcheting up of the rhetoric, particularly with everybody else together also, which Trump was also actually not able to do. So what goes on from here? Where does this go from here? Because obviously it's sort of the raging bull conversation, and what happens to the economic outlook as a part of that consequence? Where do we go from here?
I have been absolutely bewildered. Sorry, man, just charging something. I am absolutely bewildered that the rest of the world has been able to forgive forgive the United States as quickly as they have been. Sorry, everybody, pardon me. Has been able to forgive forgive the United States as quickly as they have been, right? Because the way the political structures work in the United States is it is very possible that you could have a climate-denying president in 2024 from the Republican Party who takes you straight out of Paris again. Obviously Joe Biden is not that guy, right? But there was a lot of damage done to American allies, right? If I'm Angela Merkel, I'm not happy with the last 4 years, it's been amazing how quickly the rest of the world has gotten on board with Jake Sullivan leading the charge as the head China policy person on getting the world to uniformly condemn China over issues such as Xinjiang, worker rights, Taiwan pressures, and the like. Now, the scary scenario in all of this is the inward-looking China. The China goes inward. So something I want to be very clear about, Rajiv, is the fact that the Chinese have done very, very little in retaliation against the United States in the past 4 years. So I challenge everyone in the audience to think of three or four things that the Chinese have done in retaliation to the tweet diplomacy and the daily barrage of boycotts, embargoes, and sanctions that the Trump administration did against Hong Kong and against China on a slew of issues: Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, cybersecurity, you name it, right? So the concern is that China says, we're done, just looks inward. We're going to spend $150 billion on semiconductor R&D to make sure we're independent. We're going to make sure that we have everything that we need ourselves to be domestically secure. Because at the end of the day, it revolves around the following. Number one goal of the Communist Party is preservation of the Communist Party. And the party has realized that if it can control everything domestically, everything domestically, right? Tiananmen Square proved that. That's the most extreme example. But what can't China control? Well, it can't control what the US does when they ban semiconductors, right? And it can't control what Japan did in the 30s, which still is the is scarred into the Communist Party in terms of this is what foreigners can do to us, right? And how do you stop foreigners from doing it with us? Well, a couple of ways. You don't deal with them, right? And you look inward. And an inward look in China is not a good thing for the world, right? Because Australian iron ore producers don't really win if China's looking inward and they do it all themselves. Exporters across Asia doesn't win if China just buys life insurance and doesn't build airports, right? That sort of thing. So I think look, 1.4 billion people is a huge economy unto itself, right? So I think it's less about an inward-looking China is about changing the composition of growth versus the aggregate level of growth. Now, clearly, an inward-looking China ain't good for the world, right? But it's not as dire as you think from a Chinese growth perspective.
Great point. Great point. So the other question, I think, was basically you spoke about the rule of a life, and that obviously eroding the the institutional strengths in China. How good or bad is it? Is there any recent evidence of their independence, or are you seeing that sort of eroding more? And if that happens, so what does that mean for China that's a world power in the future?
Oh God! I'm about to they give out Nobel prizes for this sort of work, Rajiv. So just bear with me. I like to joke that Xi Jinping doesn't have my cell phone number, and the opaqueness of the political machinations of the party, particularly the upper echelon, is very true. But and it's pronounced and the like, and none of us on this call have an edge in this discussion. But we can be concerned. Look, that the checks and balances that Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, etc., to eventually to Xi Jinping initially. They worked, right? And they allowed safe transitions of power. Because Deng Xiaoping came to office after the Gang of Four, and after immense violence in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution and the like. It's problematic if something bad happens, right? Because you had the checks and balances in place. Now, would I be surprised if there is not a plan B amongst the different factions for someone to step up? Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it could be. But there's also this Xi Jinping has this notion that the party needs this Mao-like figure to coalesce behind and to be supported, and that's going to rise the party up. Could be true. I think the party did, admittedly the party had its issues prior to Xi Jinping, and corruption being the biggest part of that. But it does, look, ruler for life creates ruler for life problems. And those are that there's a power vacuum. Now, does the military step up? These are all scenarios. So I strongly recommend that everyone read a guy by the name of Jude Blanchett. And Jude is the head of a think tank in DC, Washington called CSIS. And CSIS is, I'm going to just pop that in the chat. And CSIS is, and Jude is the sort of the leading political authority on structures like this. He is very, very nervous, very, very nervous about the prospect of Xi dying in office. And again, it's the great existential threat to all our investments. It's an unhedgeable risk. I don't think we can get life insurance on Xi Jinping last time I looked. And because that would be the only hedge against something like this happen, which would be dire. But look, the same problems are in Russia. And we've seen that with strongmen in other countries when they've died in office, that can be problematic. The difference, obviously, in the China and Russia context is nuclear weapons.
Absolutely, absolutely. So moving on to the next one, I think there was one question you were sort of, showing the underperformance of the Asian tech stock vis-a-vis the American tech
Yeah.
stock, and you're
Yep.
saying that the future is going to be very bright, obviously because these are more, the Alibaba versus Amazon. So can you sort of, put a little bit of a, timeline or a framework or a number, or what kind of delta differences do you see in terms of tech growth that you're seeing in Chinese tech? Are you able to
Uh,
expand a little further on that?
in terms of when do I think the recalibration is going to occur?
When or how much more, what kind of uptake are we likely to see? I mean, any flavor that you can add there. I'm,
Rajiv,
I'm sure you don't want to project
no,
anything.
no. It's not that per se. It's just there's no answer to that question, right? Because what do we need? We need signs. We need signs that the clampdown is going to end, right? Now, when are we getting signs of that? That's anybody's guess, right? I would have thought I would have thought 2 months ago, when Ant Group was given a license to start a new business in Shenzhen. I think it was Shenzhen. I think that was a point of a thawing of regulation, and then the Cybersecurity Administration suddenly becomes relevant, and we have a whole new wave of this. And that's why I made the comment before. If you're, the advantage of an audience like this is that, if you've got a 5-year view, a 20% drawdown is something you can handle, right? And that's okay. Now, if I'm working for a hedge fund, I can't do that, right? Because I can't have a 20% drawdown. So this is a much better trade for people who have permanent capital, i.e., a family office, because we don't know yet. Now, if you buy Alibaba today and it falls 20%, is it going to be painful? Yeah. And it's very hard to keep one's 5-year vision in the face of something like that. But the reality is the short answer is we do not know, right? I mean, I would never have predicted that a basket of Chinese tech stocks would underperform the NASDAQ by roughly 45% since March, right? It's remarkable, but that's exactly where we are. And so I think we've got to look at this in terms of time frame. On a 5-year view, you can start dipping your toe into the water now. If you're looking to trade this for 3 months, then it's uninvestable near term.
Great points. So let's talk about the prestige of listing in the U.S. markets. I think and the PCAOB story that has sort of emerged in the last a year and a couple of years. I think the Chinese story is perhaps particularly pertinent here. 2010 build-up of 43 companies, then Alibaba happening 2014, then the 17 to 19 push, and of course it all culminated in licking coffee, sort of going down or up in flames, as it were. Obviously, listing in the U.S. is a little bit of a prestige for every lots of companies around the world. So India is no stranger to that. I was at Infosys and we went to the NASDAQ as well. So what is the story there? I mean, given the PCAOB's aggressive stance on audits and how it has to be done, and the new rules that have now come in and are in the Congress right now, is that story likely to pan out? I mean, given what your experience and understanding in China is, how do you see that panning out? Would that be a story going forward?
Well, let's word it slightly differently. I see no scenario currently where they're not delisted, right? So the problem, the problem is that for these companies not to be delisted, US regulators need access to the books and records of Chinese companies. Now, my best guess that most of the books and records of Chinese companies are pretty boring and don't actually do anything from a national security standpoint, right? But at the end of the day, the Chinese take data very seriously as a national security concern. Now, I think that the United States Congress, if the shoe was on the other foot, would not allow the CSRC to go in and regulate Google if it had a Hong Kong listing. I think they probably wouldn't let that happen, right? So, again, unless China's going to unless the US is going to accept that it's okay to give preferential treatment to a Chinese company, unless the Chinese say, what, data security is not as important as it was, we'll let you audit these books. Unless that happens, this path to delisting is moving ahead. It's not going to stop. And on the Chinese side of things, this push on the variable interest entity side of things is, again, ambiguity for the last 20 years. But that's certainly a push to get people to list in Hong Kong, undeniably so. And I think that obviously it affected Didi. Now, why was Didi targeted from a national security concern? Because Didi doesn't want the US government to access the amount of rides that go to a military base in China. Right? That's the sort of thing that they didn't want to happen. Now, whilst I think that teenagers doing dance videos on TikTok is not really a national security concern, and for any of you who've got teenage kids, I think you can almost guarantee that that's not a national security concern. ByteDance won't list in the United States. I would be amazed if that was to happen. And I think we've seen the last major listing of a Chinese company in the United States. I really don't see how that's going to change in the near term. I think it's I think that's inevitable, that the delisting that this process is underway and irreversible.
That's interesting. So one point that I think you wanted to talk about, or we wanted to ask you also, was about Taiwan, and perhaps a little bit more of a context of the semiconductor industry, because obviously Taiwanese are the big boys in that industry. So is that linked? What is this? You belong to a story. Where's that going?
So a friend of mine jokes that the safest place on the planet in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is the investor relation room at TSMC, because there's a couple of things here. One is, I think it's wrong. It's certainly wrong and naive for people to say that the semiconductor security angle is part of China's reasoning here. This goes back a very, very long way. Now, again, let's go back to the fundamental point. Number one goal of the Communist Party: preservation of the Communist Party, right? So despite the fact that the Chinese have bridged the gap between the United States with the United States militarily, there is no guarantee at all that China could win if they invade Taiwan, right? At a minimum, it is going to be a guerrilla war disaster if that does occur, right? Forget the nuclear involvement for a second. Let's put that to one side. Let's say cooler heads prevail in that regard. Put it this way, the existential threat to Xi Jinping, right, and is if he tries to take Taiwan and fails, because he's out, right? And what happens to rulers for life if they get kicked out? Well, they lose their money, and their families lose their money, and that's a really important part of this. So, why I'm not that bearish about the Taiwan situation is that unless Xi Jinping is 100% guaranteed that he will win this, right? Because if he loses, he's out, he's purged, he's in a prison, right? He's not going to do it. He's not going to do it. So we've had bluster and rhetoric from leaders for decades about Taiwan, right? And it's never happened. And it's never happened because there's no guarantee they can win. Now, you ask me now, does Taiwan ever become officially part of China? I don't think it does. I think there's too much nationalistic and independent thinking in Taiwan for that to happen. I think it is going to be an ongoing tension that we will talk for decades to come, and nothing will ever really happen as a response.
So there's an interesting question from Jeevan. So basically this pertains to the shadow banking sector versus the mainstream banking sector. Obviously, it's quite large in China. Yep. I think Jeevan's question is the following. Is this sort of, creating a domestic asset bubble? Obviously, because, outbound investment is not really permitted from the Chinese side of the fence. Is that one of the reasons why the MSCI representation of Chinese equities, under
No, to take that last point first. No, that it's governance issues, it's disclosure issues, it's free float issues. Look, at the end of the day, China is, to view China as an emerging market is wrong. But China, from a capital market standpoint, is not far off an emerging market, right? So I think that is the main reason that it's just not. There's a lot of transparency and governance and shareholder, shareholder rights issues, these sort of things are much more important to that. But onto the shadow banking side, it's real. Real in the context it remains a dominant part of this, and that's because you have China is a great innovator in many things. Financial products is not one of them, right? And it's hard for Bridgewater or Fidelity or the bigger global asset managers to be in China. And JP Morgan now has a license to be a fully owned subsidiary, but the reality to have its own fully owned subsidiary. But the reality is it going to do that if it has to localize all the data and stuff like that? So it's far from certain we get there. But look, over time, the shadow banking, as yields continue to fall, shadow banking will remain attractive. But look, I think that with 6% of household balance sheets in equities, that number's going to go up, right? And that's going to go up in terms of the equivalence of mutual funds, ETF structures when they're legalized. These sort of things are going to be more and more prevalent. Shadow banking is always going to be there, and shadow banking exists because of the inefficiencies that exist in the Chinese banking system. But let's be clear, Ant Group and Tencent, to a lesser degree, have helped to alleviate a lot of those stresses. And you combine that with the more stringent regulation you've had over shadow banking over the course of the last 4 years. And whilst it's still important, it's not the driver that it used to be. I don't think it's a precursor for asset bubbles. I mean, it's the inefficiencies that it represents rather than sort of the dominance of it.
Got it. Last couple of questions, really. One. CBDC, Chinese CBDC, how much of a game changer is it? I mean, obviously, I couldn't resist but ask that, obviously, given the craze around the cybercurrency in the world right now. So how much of a game changer is this Chinese CBDC?
I think it is huge. I think we need to be really careful, though, extrapolating out 25 years forward to programmable currency and, the way we can fine-tune monetary policy by issuing a bunch of digital RMB and dropping it into Shenzhen because they're having a recession and it dissolves in 90 days' time. So you got to spend it. Great. 25 years' time, that could happen, right? In the here and now, it's in the here and now we have it. It's called It's called PayPal, right? We have digital currency, right? And I think it's interesting. I do think that I think it's going to face real issues about and we didn't talk about the internationalization, which I'm a tremendous skeptic of. Do you think Prime Minister Modi is going to allow Indian companies to trade with digital RMB if the PBOC has already told you that it'll be monitored? They're calling it controllable anonymity at the PBOC, which means every transaction is monitored. So Australia's not doing that, and India's not doing that, and Japan's not doing that. So I think that it's going to be more a domestically focused thing. And as I alluded to with the comments about shadow banking, the Chinese banking system is becoming rapidly incredibly efficient. It's the best fintech market in the world. It's growing exponentially, and whilst the digital RMB helps that, until we get to that utopian world of programmable currency, we're not there yet. And I think for me, one of the most overhyped narratives of the next 5 years is the push to digital currency, because A, I think we have it already, and B, that the United States will never adopt it. The United States will never adopt. Do you think Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz are going to say we'll vote for a digital currency? Because what do you mean we can monitor every transaction? The privacy provision, the privacy side alone will mean it won't pass in the United States. I firmly believe that.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. If people want to find you, where can they find you?
They can find me in the email address at that's in this presentation. They can find me in London or Hong Kong or on a plane somewhere. Plane Wi-Fi is a wonderful thing. Email address and the like is in the presentation. And Rajiv, thank you. This was good fun. This was a great conversation.
Fantastic. I hope to take some tips on you from on how to avoid the quarantine regulation, in terms of traveling around the world. We all look forward to more travel. That's one thing I think that's coming out of everybody right now. So, thank you so much, Paul. Really fabulous. Enjoy the conversation. Look forward to further such. And I believe you're going to be in the Indian shows, in the near future. So look forward to having you more on face to face as well. Thank you so much.
Very much looking forward. Everyone, thank you so much for your time.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.